are 1,189 chapters in the Bible. I know that because I counted them. And what I can tell you is that some of it is incredibly easy to understand. I don't think you have to be a Rhodes Scholar to read the words, "Thou shalt not know exactly what it is that you're not supposed to do." Some things are pretty easy, and some things are not. Did you ever know anybody, or maybe you know somebody, or maybe you are somebody who enjoys putting together jigsaw puzzles? I don't mean the small ones with the great big pieces. I'm talking about those 1,000-piece puzzles of some wooden landscape with an overwhelming array of variations of one color, say the color green, those kind of puzzles. And I don't know about you, I can't tolerate more than about 10 minutes trying to sort or match or join any of those pieces together, let alone finish it. So I look at one of those puzzles, all I see is a box filled with disjointed, mismatched, never to be assembled, meaningless pieces that make no sense at all. And that's the way a book like Leviticus looks to many of us. It's a whole lot of difficult stuff, none of which seems to make any sense. You try to read it, and it's something like da-da-da-da-da-da-da, put it on the fire. And you have no idea why in the world the God of heaven would share this with you. Or you read something like this morning's passage, and you're left with the sense that God has this enormous ledger of do's and don'ts that are expected to be followed without any question, amendment, or deviation. And I get that. I do. But let me start at the beginning, because some of you here today have been in the church since the cradle. I've been at this for a long time. But some of you might say, you know, I haven't been in this following Jesus thing for very long. And I don't really know everything that's in the Bible. So let's start there. Your Bible is divided into two parts. I think most of us know that. We generally think of it as Old Testament and New Testament. The first 2/3 of the Bible, which is called the Old Testament, is written in Hebrew and Aramaic. Those are ancient scripts that don't have anything to do with something you might see on a road sign if you were driving through downtown Jerusalem. The last third, which we call the New Testament, is written in Greek. So you've got Hebrew and Aramaic, and you've got Greek. But when you take apart the Hebrew and the Aramaic sections, there are actually three parts to it. About 200 years before Jesus, there was a group of rabbinical scholars who decided to break up the Hebrew scriptures into three parts. The first part is called the law, the second part is called the prophets, and the third part is called the writings. The first part, the law, are the 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Sometimes Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you went to school at the time of Jesus, you would have gone to the local synagogue. Ladies, you would have learned to read and write at home. But guys, you would have gone to a rabbi at a synagogue where you would have learned Numbers and Deuteronomy. You would have learned math from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You might notice that there's a pattern here. So the idea is that these first 5 books were written mostly by Moses, but not completely. I don't think, for example, that Moses wrote the section about his death. That section, which is in Deuteronomy 34, was probably written by Joshua. But for the most part, these 5 books are the word that God gave to Moses. That's the law. Then there's the prophets. The prophets are divided into 2 sections, major prophets and minor prophets. And that just means big books and smaller books. It's not like major leagues and minor leagues. You don't have minor prophets that work their way up to the majors or anything like that. It's just less minor, major. And this is divided again into 4 sections. You have prophets who are writing at the time of the 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Prophets who wrote when the northern kingdom was taken away into captivity. You have prophets who were writing when the southern kingdom was taken into captivity, and the ones who were there when everybody came back. A good way to think about it, at least I'm trying to design an example here, is if you came from a family with two brothers. You'll probably get this illustration if that's the case. I didn't have any brothers. I had several school buddies. An idea of the relationship that existed and how the parental element played out between them. So you've got 13 brothers sent off to bed in the same bedroom. Do they always behave like angels and go right to sleep? Parents who have two boys? Of course not. They'll giggle and talk and shoot rubber bands and have pillow fights and laugh. And at some point, when it starts to get too loud, the dad will come down to the base of the stairs and he'll say, "Knock it off or I'm coming up there." So the brothers will stop for a while, but then slowly start goofing off again, which gets louder and louder. And finally, dad comes up and he takes the older brother out into the hall. So the first prophets are the prophets that had to do with Israel and Judah, two brothers, and God said, "Knock it off, or I'm coming down there and I'm taking you out of your land." And of course, they didn't change their ways, so the older brother Israel is taken away. So let's go back to our imaginary two brothers at home. The older brother is taken out of the room. Does the remaining brother behave? He's a boy. Probably not. He starts to dismantle the bed or do something that makes a lot of noise, and dad comes up again, and now both brothers are out of their room and are sitting in chairs at the opposite end of the hallway. So it was with Israel and Judah. Some of the prophets were given while Israel was still around, some when the prophets were given when Israel and Judah were taken to go home. Some of the prophets back home. The northern kingdom was lost, the southern kingdom returned. And those are the post-exilic prophets. You have the law, you have the prophets, and then you have a series of other books, God's view of what's happening. So for instance, God's view on how things normally are, proper. They're God's view on how things normally play out. For example, watch my dog Elliot while I was away, I'd probably tell you this is when he eats. But of course, he won't do that when I'm away because he's going to be stressed while I'm gone and he's with people he doesn't know. So he's not going to eat it. So I'm only telling you how things normally work. Well, that's Proverbs. How things normally work. Might not. This is how things are designed to work most of the time. How about a book like Ruth? Friendship designed to work. Or if you really don't have anything to do on a Saturday afternoon, the Song of Solomon. How romantic, intimate love is supposed to work as part of your life. It's in there too, because God created everything about you're able to ingest food. He gave you taste buds. What does that tell you about God? It should tell you that he doesn't just want you to exist. He wants you to live and enjoy life, and not just on a spiritual level. He wants you to enjoy the experience of the physical life that he's given you. So please don't come in and think that you have to sacrifice, love God and suffer. Go out in the world and preach the gospel and bear your cross and then die and go to heaven. Because none of that tells me why God made chocolate. I mean, God made chocolate and coffee and peanut butter because he's a good God. All right, so we have the laws and we have the writings. So let's go back to the law. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is the legal voice of God. And I want to zero in on what the law is. Because the law is not only one thing, it's actually three different things. And if you get this wrong, a lot of the Bible is not going to make any sense. And a lot of it doesn't make sense because we come up with those unbelievable things about the law, like the law is a tutor unto us like God was unto Christ, and then we summarily just discard it, and now we can do whatever we want. Or I'll hear people say, law is bad, grace is good. Simple word for that is nonsense. You see, the law establishes the way God thinks. I've used this example before, but I have two older sisters. My parents had rules for my sisters. They weren't my rules, they belonged to my siblings, but I could learn a lot about my parents, how they thought from the rules and the boundaries that they set for my sisters. Same is true when we look and see how God thinks in Scripture, how his mind works. It lets us understand something about the boundaries that he sets for us and why. Now, there's something else I want to realize, that it was kill a goat to make God happy. So why in the world do you need to know why Israel had to understand what it was for? And I need to squash an idea that the idea that the law somehow has been done away. Jesus said to destroy or abolish the law. I came to what? Fulfill the law. But fulfill doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that being just kept all the laws, then retired them all. Jesus never fulfilled a single God. As far as we know, he never cleaned any mold off a tent. While they lived nomadically for nearly 40 years in the desert. Fulfilled doesn't mean I kept them, thereby sending them into retirement. That's not what it means. To pleraho, which is a word that means to dominate or fill up, but it's also a medical term. Get it right. Anybody here ever have a broken bone? I know it's not a pleasant thought, or memory for those who have gone through it. Sometime back, I fractured my thumb in two places while I was chopping firewood. One of those metal wedges that you put on the top, hit it with a sledgehammer and the log splits. I had this petrified piece of oak, have a down, and I'm balancing my leg and I'm trying to get this wedge to go in. It won't go in. And about the third time, and I hit this wedge, and the wedge went one way, and the sledgehammer came down on my thumb. So, I don't know. I think I immediately stood up, and I did a rather unique dance for a couple of minutes, and I was trying to testimony the entire time, finding myself that no one ever. Now, many times with a broken bone, the doctor has to set it back where it needs to be so it can mend and heal properly. And the whole idea is that wordplay means I came to set it back in its right position. So when Jesus uses the law in Matthew, he used a form said, but I say unto you. You remember that? You've heard it. It said, don't kill with your hands or a weapon. But I say unto you, what? Don't kill with your words, your thought, your attitude. You heard this, but I said that, which includes all of these other things as well. He's not changing the law because Jesus is saying, you got the list, but you missed the point. Now, how do we deal with the law of Leviticus? That we can directly apply to our life. Talking about some pretty heavy things here. So I'm going to divide it. I know I have to move quickly. And by the way, this sermon happens to be, this is a compilation of about 3 Bible studies that I did on Leviticus. So you're getting a very abbreviated form of it here. But I've divided into 3 parts, and they're the 3 parts that were taught when Jesus was growing up. First, there is the civil code of law. Now, I want you to imagine that God has put you in charge of leading the entire agape congregation, old, young, singles, families, adults, children, everyone, on a camping trip in the desert. Days. How many of you would jump at the chance to take on that kind of responsibility? My hand didn't go up. You see, that was Moses' problem. God put him on a 38-plus year camping trip with people he barely knew who were angry with him the day that he met them. So God gave what's called the Code of Law. You'll find it in 2 books, Exodus and Numbers. Now, it may sound a bit Egypt to Mount Sinai, and Numbers gets you from Mount Sinai to Mount Nebo outside the Promised Land. So Numbers together to get the Israelites' whole journey of almost 40 years. And in that, there's law. Not everything. Some things are just accounts of what happened, but the vast majority of what's in these books is to tell you how it was and how it was supposed to be. Now, if you know anything about the Sinai Desert, it is not a happy, enjoyable place to find yourself. Not many people are going to book their vacation to spend in the middle of the Sinai Desert. It's unbearably hot in the daytime with temperatures soaring well above the century mark, and it's horribly cold at night. And we all know that when people get together generally, they tend not to behave. That's why we have rules in virtually every organization. These tendencies to behave badly are exacerbated when the circumstances are difficult and unpleasant, such as for the Israelites in the Sinai for 40 years. So in Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23, you have how to get along on a camping trip in the desert. Kill your neighbor in the desert when it's hot as blazes in the daytime and freezing cold at night. It's not going to be fun. There's going to be times when people are going to be screaming, "We don't have any water to drink." And so here are the rules. But that's not all. 6, 15, 28, 29, and 30. 6 more chapters of what we call the Civil Code of Law. It's simply how to get along on a camping trip and be civil. Rules, by the way, still work. Did you know that civility is still a good thing? Here's a Civil Code of Law. If you find mold on your tent, what should you do about your mold problem? You should fix your mold problem, because if you don't fix your mold problem will become my problem. And so you ask, well, if you're married, or you decide to have children, I'd ask you, if you don't, the rest of us are going to have to pay a jailer to take responsibility for them later on. Now, I'm not saying that good parents don't have kids who rebel and end up in bad. Nor am I saying that all children who come out of bad situations turn out badly. But we all know that there are statistical norms. Children who come from loving homes that spend quality time with their kids, set enforceable boundaries for them, and instill them with a moral compass, those kids statistically are going to have a better chance of becoming responsible, productive, quality, law-abiding, moral, and ethical adults. So the normative rule that applies to us from such Old Testament civil law rules is that grace or no grace, God expects us to act responsibly towards that which has been placed in our possession or under our governance. And to that end, the spiritual principles we find in the Civil Code of Law still work. Okay, this civil code is called the first law. But there's a second law called the constitutional law. And it's found in... Let's not always see the same hands. It's second law. Anybody who got second law, you can stay after class and clean the erasers, okay? Second law, who knew? There's a second law, and it consists of 15 articles of a constitution of how to live in a godly way as a nation. Because you're claiming the one true God is your God. And can I just tell you that every nation in the world shapes its own God? Israel wasn't to shape a God, they were to hear from and follow one. And by the way, secular America does this too. You know, when you read in the Old Testament about pagan gods, then their god was named so-and-so, or they made a god and they formed a god, and you thought, how stupid. I mean, they just carved this god out of a chunk of wood, and now they're bowing down to it. That's exactly what a secular America does. There's a God formed in America that always thinks that we're right and always wants to bless us. Forget that we kicked him out of the schools, and forget that we don't even want to talk about him or have any kind of a moral standard. America has a type of God that always loves us and never asks us to do anything. And that's the God that secular America has formed with its hands and that it bows down to and worships. Okay, so the constitutional law in Deuteronomy is about how to build a nation that honors God. So then, what is Leviticus 4? We've got the civil code of law, how to get along on a 4-decade camping trip. We've got a constitutional law that came about 30 plus years later about how to have a nation that honors God. And there's a book in Hebrew called Vayikra. I can never pronounce these things correctly. Which means, and he called. Now, how many think that's a lousy name that's never going to sell on Amazon? Now remember, you have to remember, in ancient times, they didn't have books like we have. They had scrolls. And so whatever the first 3 words are on the scroll, that was the name of the book. So when you open the first book of the Bible, what are the first 3 words? In the beginning. Bereshit. It's Genesis. Genesis is the English term for beginning or origin. But in Hebrew, it's called Bereshit. But Leviticus is, and he called, because that's the first 3 words. Now, when you look into Leviticus, and let's take it apart for a minute, what is it? It's the criminal code of law. So you have civil, constitutional, and criminal. And listen, I know this might not be scintillating stuff, but if you take the time to get it, you're going to understand a great deal about how God thinks. Picture it in this way. God is not a mommy in the sky trying to make you feel better. He's a judicial dad, and he thinks in judicial terms. And that's not a bad thing. Some people think that sounds so mean. Listen, if you're on the right side of the law, you might think it sounds mean or it sounds cold, but when you're a victim, when you've been victimized by somebody, what are you going to want then? You're going to want the law to come in and take a stand and right what was done wrong to you. To a criminal, the police and judges are bad, but a law-abiding citizen, law enforcement and the judicial system are supposed to stand up for us. So when you look at God as a judge, don't think of it as a bad thing. Think of it as a good thing for the person who's doing what they're supposed to be doing. The only ones who despise God as judge are those who want to rebel against him and who want to be all right in their rebellion. So the criminal code of law, as a preface, I'm going to say something. There's something wrong with you. But when I say that, there's something wrong with me too. All of us were born with 3 problems, actually more than 3, but only 3 that I'm going to talk about. The first one is that you were born into the middle of a war in a fallen world. It's a world that is bent toward rebellion. And the second problem is when you were born, the default switch in the software of your heart was also set on rebel. I want to do what I want to do, and don't tell me who I am or what I am. I want to do what I want. That's a fundamental reason why we have the fight over gender today. Because God can't even tell me what he made me to be. I'm just going to throw a switch on how I feel about who I am. And I can tell you this. If an archaeologist digs up your remains 1,000 years from now, you're either going to be a male or a female, and it doesn't matter how you thought you were today. That's science. And if that sounds harsh, all I can tell you is that reality tends to be very stubborn. I was looking at my bank book the other day, and you know what? I felt like a millionaire. But my bank doesn't agree. Now, here's my point. At birth, I'm set with the default switch for rebel. I've got a fallen world around me that loves to sing about how good it is to wallow in rebellion. And in addition, there's a healthy dose of demonic presence that are all around the earth saying, do it wrong. It's okay, do it wrong. So I've got 3 problems I'm facing right out of the gate. Leviticus is divided into 3 parts, so let's chop it up really quickly here. Chapters 1 through 7 sets out the times when God says it's time to kill and grill. Now, that's probably the worst way to present this material, but I've already done it. So here's the first part of the book is about sacrifice and offerings. Then in chapters 8, 9, and 10, it tells us who actually is supposed to grill. And then in 11 through 27 are applications and laws that Levites had to know about. So who are the Levites? Levite just means a son of the tribe of Levi. And some of them were in the family of Moses and Aaron, and those Levites are called priests. Not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites. That make sense? So there's a garden variety Levite, and they're supposed to do some spiritual things that help push God's truth everywhere. And then the priests are supposed to do specific things related to helping God's people interface with God in the temple and the tabernacle. Now, I can look at some of you right now and see that you're thinking, this book doesn't apply to me. Yes, it does. Let me see if I can show you. If you went to Leviticus 1, you would see an offering called the Ole offering. Say Ole. Ole. Say it. It's Ole. Okay. Aliyah means to go up. Ole means to go up. It's the idea that God says, I want you to bring this animal in. I want you to incinerate the animal on the grill. You bring in the animal, you put it in a pen, it's inspected by the priest, you take the animal's life, you drain off the blood, you put your hand on the animal's head, you portion out the animal, it's put on the grill, and it becomes nothing but smoke and ash. It's wholly and completely an offering to God. That's chapter 1. This is a dedicatory offering. It's a burnt offering that is solely a dedication to God. So when I bring this animal in, it belongs to God, and I get nothing to take back for myself. Nobody eats this. God gets it all as a sweet, savory aroma, period. Now, there is an offering, I should say, as a question. Is there any offering anywhere in the New Testament where you can hear God tell you that in order to dedicate yourself to Him, you have to bring yourself to Him, lay yourself before Him, your entire life is opened up, and everything that you have belongs to Him? Is there anything like that, say, I don't know, in Romans 12, 1 and 2? You see, the book of Romans is structured to say to you, you were lost in chapters 1, 2, and 3, but God, who is rich in mercy, sent His Son to die in your place to make it possible for you to be justified before Him in chapters 4 and 5. And in 6, 7, and 8, He gave you everything necessary to grow you up in Him. He gave you His Spirit so you might thrive in Him. And in chapters 9, 10, and 11, He takes care of Israel in the past, in the present, and the future. And he says, because all of that is true, in chapter 12, verse 1, he says, I want you to stop. I want you to take your body, put it in the pen to be inspected, top to bottom. I want God to look at everything that is in you. I want you to submit yourself wholly to him. And I want you to stop being pressed into the mold of the world, but to be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you can show God things about your life that are going to make him smile. See, that's Leviticus 1. It's just stated again in Romans 12. And the idea is that God has the right to tell you to lay everything down because he gave you everything you have. Let me tell you something that I become more and more aware of with each passing day. You and I are one heartbeat away from not being here. And each heartbeat that we have is gifted to us by the God who made us. You're not making yourself able to stay alive here on this planet. This planet is habitable because God made it habitable. And he's the one who holds the number of your days in his hands. So let's go to chapter 2. Chapter 2 talks about a grain offering, which is an offering to express gratitude to God for his provision and his grace. So what it's talking about is if you want to come and bring some grain to the Lord, and you've got this seed, and you bring the seed in, and you bring a stalk of barley, and if it's time when you can flour, you can make flour, and if it's time to make cakes, you can make cakes, and you bring part or a portion of this to God. It's the muha, or the slice or apportionment offering. And here's what God says. He says, look, at every point in your week, at every point in your year, I want what you right now. Whether it's grain or seed or flour or cakes. Don't tomorrow. Tell me about now. So how does that apply to us? Well, have you ever heard someone say, or have you ever said, I'll dedicate my life to Jesus just as soon as I get through college. I'll give myself wholly to Christ just as soon as I get a steady job. No, you won't. You see, the problem is, if that person is you, the problem is you're taking you with you. You're not going with God. And there are layers of calluses that grow every time Jesus looks for you to yield to him, and you say, oh. And every time you put it off, there's another layer of calluses and another, and each layer makes it harder for you to ever, yeah, I'm yours. So here's the point. 2, it says, at every point in your year, I want you to be ready to give me what you have right now. If you're not ready to give Jesus what he's asking for right now, be carefully, because I mean this with all my heart. And I also know this from experience. If you will not yield everything to him, the one thing you won't give him is going to be the very thing that your life is going to be about. I'll give Jesus everything, but that relationship, guess what your life's going to be about? That relationship. I'll give him everything but that bottle. It'll be about that bottle, or that job, or that next big business deal. See, it didn't matter that Eve was reaching out for some fruit. She could have been touching wet paint. It didn't make any difference what it was, what in my mind that I've got to do this, or I've got to keep that, or I've got to get that over there because I've decided that God is not looking out for me, so I've got to look out for myself, and what matters to me, that's sin right there. For Eve, her sin wasn't eating the fruit, it was reaching for it in the first place. Sin is of the heart, not the hands. The hands follow the heart. Okay, so I've got a dedicatory offering. I have an offering where I give God a portion of what I've got right now. What about the third chapter? It's going to be a total of 5 of these, and then I'll actually let you get the Bible today. The third chapter, there's another offering. Did you know that there's a well-being offering? It's called Zebach Shalamim. Shalamim is kind of like the word shalom. And shalom, do we know what that means? Peace. And that's one of the proper ways of saying it. In fact, this is referring to a peace offering. If you go back and you look at an outline for Leviticus, chapter 4 is peace offering. Another way to define shalom is like when you're at home, there's a family, the kids are quiet, your spouse is reading, the dog is in his bed, and the cat is nestled in the corner. You have your cup of coffee, and you're in shalom. It's when everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. Shalamim is similar. It's like this. If I go into a cafe in Jerusalem and I have breakfast, at the end of the meal, I ask for the bill. Shalamim means to balance the bill. Leviticus 3, God gives me a son, which he did. Or he gives you a daughter. Increase that you weren't expecting. I bring a shlamim, which is when I bring an animal into the temple, they kill the animal, they grill it, and everybody comes and celebrates my in the party, including the Levites. The idea is that you bring it to the tabernacle or the temple, you say to God, thank you for what you've given me. That's shlamim. That's Leviticus 3. And how does that apply to us? Let me share something with you. God loves a good party. He just wants to be invited. And if it's a party that he can't attend, you shouldn't be there either. Another thing, he leads. Second to you or me or anyone else. Because he's the highest, and allowing second to play the role of first is like reading math, and he doesn't do it. Okay. In chapter 4, there's an offering called Hatanah. Hatanah? Hatanah. Don't spit on anybody. Hatanah. Okay. Hatanah is the reason that no one lets me play basketball. Because I not only cannot get the ball in the hoop, I can't even hit the backboard that the hoop is mounted to. Hatanah means missing the mark. And the point of Hatanah is whether I mean it or not, when God has called me to do. Also in the Bible, there's a difference between malice and guilt. Malice means I meant to do it wrong. Guilt means I did it wrong. You see, sometimes, especially young people, they'll say, but I didn't mean to do it, as if that means that they didn't do it. If you hit another car because you're fiddling with the radio or playing around with your cell phone, you didn't hit the and if you mean to do it, then that's malice, and that's something entirely different. But if it happens because you're negligent and careless, you're still responsible for the damage that you caused. And intent doesn't matter. So biblically, you're guilty if you do something wrong, not only if you meant to do it wrong. So when a young girl comes in and tells me as a pastor, I'm pregnant and it was an accident, I have to tell her, no, dear, it's a bad decision. There's a difference. Here's the point. Is for doing wrong, even offering to atone for unintentional sins. Now, getting to the last one, a guilt offering, which is meant to make reparations for intentional wrongdoing. An emphasis here that we need to take note of. A sham literally means if I take something that God has made or given intended holy purpose and I use it in some other way. It could be something as simple as using a knife that was used to sacrifice the lambs to, cut a sandwich in the. Now it's usually not that, for the most part it isn't. But God says, I designed. And when you don't use your life to do the things, you're going to make a mess out of it. If you try and fix something with a hammer when you should use a screwdriver or a wrench, well, you're probably going to for a purpose, and that's the only purpose that you should use it for. And the last part of Leviticus, from chapters 11 to 27, it gives us the ways to apply what's in the beginning of the book. So in the beginning, there's these ways of sacrificing, but in the second part, it tells you when and how to use those offerings. Do you know when a sham is used? Used as a dedication offering that you. And it's never the female. And if anybody here is from a farm who has ever lived on a farm, you know the difference in price. The stud animal that gives you baby animals by impregnating female animals costs more than the female animal. That's just brute farm-side economics. Something that God told me to use only in a certain way or time or circumstance, I have to pay an additional price. Thing. Chapter 5 says you always pay an asham after a hatana when the wrongdoing is intentional. So you have to do both offerings. I only have to give up something sin, intentional or not. I also give up something of greater value that affects my future as a wrongdoing. My male animal affects the future. And in the future, because I had to surrender a valuable breeding male. It reduces the future stock of what I'm worth. Now, a sham, I'm doing. You know what the test case is? 19 for a sham. It's sexuality. Now, I'm not sharing this with you because I think there's a problem here about this in this congregation. But take note, because as parents, as grandparents, we have to be mindful of our young people so that they understand there are consequences for wrongdoing, especially intentional wrongdoing, especially when you do it in these circumstances, none other. There's a price to be paid, and it's going to cost you a piece of your future. When I sin, I do give up something of myself, and it affects who I am moving forward. Even if I'm a God-fearing believer, of my future, because there's a practical difference between stealing something, for example, not that that's excused, between that and sinning sexually. As I say, I not only owe God a guilt offering, I owe him a sin offering. About sexual sin, he says all other sins are outside of our body. When we sin sexually, we sin against our body. And what does that mean? It means that it costs more. It costs you a piece of your future. For younger, that you're going to make in your mind right now, that 50 years from now, if the Lord tarries, you're still going to carry in your mind and affect your life. So I'm going to end with this. It's a little child's truth to be remembered as adults and shared with our young people. He made you with a design, including and how and when intimate relationships are proper and blessed. Might sound a little to use our lives, our body, our thoughts, our everything given to us, the design that God made it for. And that, in summary, is what we find in the book of Leviticus. Let's pray. We find rules, we find laws that help us understand how you think and how you would have us to think and act and how you make it possible to walk with you. As a completely loving God who has done everything possible. And we thank you for that. In Jesus' holy name we pray.